Section 5 of The Rivals of Sherlock Holmes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Nigel Carrington in London, April 2011. The Rivals of Sherlock Holmes, Volume 1. The Dutchess of Wiltshire's Diamonds, by Guy Boothby. Part 1. To the reflective mind, the rapidity with which the inhabitants of the world's greatest city seize upon a new name or idea and familiarize themselves with it can scarcely prove otherwise than astonishing. As an illustration of my meaning, let me take the case of Klimo, the now famous private detective, who has won for himself the right to be considered as great as Lecoq, or even the late lamented Sherlock Holmes. Up to a certain morning, London had never even heard his name, nor had it the remotest notion as to who or what he might be. It was as sublimely ignorant and careless on the subject as the inhabitants of Kamchatka or Peru. Within 24 hours, however, the whole aspect of the case was changed. The man, woman, or child who had not seen his posters or heard his name was counted an ignoramus unworthy of intercourse with human beings. Princes became familiar with it as their trains tore them to Windsor to luncheon with the Queen. The nobility noticed and commented upon it as they drove about the town. Merchants and businessmen generally read it as they made their ways by omnibus or underground to their various shops and counting-houses. Street boys called each other by it as a nickname. Music-hall artistes introduced it into their patter, while it was even rumoured that the Stock Exchange itself had paused in the full flood tide of business to manufacture a riddle on the subject. That Klimo made his profession pay him well was certain. First, from the fact that his advertisements must have cost a good round sum, and second, because he had taken a mansion in Belverton Street, Park Lane, next door to Porchester House, where, to the dismay of that aristocratic neighbourhood, he advertised that he was prepared to receive and be consulted by his clients. The invitation was responded to with alacrity, and from that day forward, between the hours of 12 and 2, the pavement upon the north side of the street was lined with carriages, every one containing some person desirous of testing the great man's skill. I must here explain that I have narrated all this in order to show the state of affairs existing in Belverton Street and Park Lane when Simon Khan arrived, or was supposed to arrive, in England. If my memory serves me correctly, it was on Wednesday, the 3rd of May, that the Earl of Amberley drove to Victoria to meet and welcome the man whose acquaintance he had made in India under such peculiar circumstances, and under the spell of whose fascination he and his family had fallen so completely. Reaching the station, his lordship descended from his carriage and made his way to the platform set apart for the reception of the Continental Express. He walked with a jaunty air, and seemed to be on the best of terms with himself and the world in general. How little he suspected the existence of the noose into which he was so innocently running his head. As if out of compliment to his arrival, the train put in an appearance within a few moments of his reaching the platform. He immediately placed himself in such a position that he could make sure of seeing the man he wanted, and waited patiently until he should come in sight. Khan, however, was not among the first batch. Indeed, the majority of passengers had passed before his lordship caught sight of him. One thing was very certain: however great the crush might have been, it would have been difficult to mistake Khan's figure. The man's infirmity and the peculiar beauty of his face rendered him easily recognizable. Possibly after his long sojourn in India he found the morning cold, for he wore a long fur coat, the collar of which he turned up round his ears, thus making a fitting frame for his delicate face. On seeing Lord Amberley, he hastened forward to greet him. "This is most kind and friendly of you," he said as he shook the other by the hand. "A fine day, and Lord Amberley to meet me. One could scarcely imagine a better welcome." As he spoke, one of his Indian servants approached and salaamed before him. He gave him an order, and received an answer in Hindustani, whereupon he turned again to Lord Amberley. "You may imagine how anxious I am to see my new dwelling," he said. "My servant tells me that my carriage is here, so may I hope that you will drive back with me and see for yourself how I am likely to be lodged?" "I shall be delighted," said Lord Amberley, who was longing for the opportunity, and they accordingly went out into the station yard together to discover a brougham drawn by two magnificent horses, and with Nur Ali in all the glory of white raiment and crested turban on the box waiting to receive them. His lordship dismissed his Victoria, and when Jawar Singh had taken his place beside his fellow servant upon the box, the carriage rolled out of the station yard in the direction of Hyde Park. "I trust her ladyship is quite well," said Simon Khan politely as they turned into Gloucester Place. "Excellently well, thank you," replied his lordship. "She bade me welcome you to England in her name as well as my own, and I was to say that she's looking forward to seeing you." "She's most kind, and I shall do myself the honour of calling upon her as soon as circumstances will permit," answered Khan. "I beg you will convey my best thanks to her for her thought of me." While these polite speeches were passing between them, they were rapidly approaching a large hoarding, on which was displayed a poster setting forth the name of the now famous detective Klimo. Simon Khan, leaning forward, studied it, and when they had passed, turned to his friend again. "At Victoria, and on all the hoardings we meet, I see an enormous placard bearing the word Klimo. Pray, what does it mean?" His lordship laughed. "You're asking a question which a month ago was on the lips of 9 out of every 10 Londoners. It is only within the last fortnight that we have learned who and what Klimo is." "And pray, what is he?" "Well, the explanation's very simple. He's neither more nor less than a remarkably astute private detective, who has succeeded in attracting notice in such a way that half London has been induced to patronise him. I have had no dealings with the man myself, but a friend of mine, Lord Orpington, has been the victim of a most audacious burglary, and the police having failed to solve the mystery, he has called Klimo in. We shall therefore see what he can do before many days are past. But there, I expect you will soon know more about him than any of us." "Indeed, and why?" "For the simple reason that he has taken number 1 Belverton Terrace, the house adjoining your own, and sees his clients there." Simon Khan pursed up his lips and appeared to be considering something. "I trust you will not prove a nuisance," he said at last. "The agents who found me the house should have acquainted me with the fact. Private detectives, on however large a scale, scarcely strike one as the most desirable of neighbours, particularly for a man who is so fond of quiet as myself." At this moment they were approaching their destination. As the carriage passed Belverton Street and pulled up, Lord Amberley pointed to a long line of vehicles standing before the detective's door. "You can see for yourself something of the business he does," he said. "Those are the carriages of his clients, and it is probable that twice as many have arrived on foot." "I shall certainly speak to the agent on the subject," said Khan, with a shadow of annoyance upon his face. "I consider the fact of this man's being so close to me a serious drawback to the house." Jawar Singh here descended from the box and opened the door in order that his master and his guest might alight, while portly Ram Gafur, the butler, came down the steps and salaamed before them with oriental obsequiousness. Khan greeted his domestics with kindly condescension, and then, accompanied by the ex-viceroy, entered his new abode. "I think you may congratulate yourself upon having secured one of the most desirable residents in London," said his lordship 10 minutes or so later, when they had explored the principal rooms. "I'm very glad to hear you say so," said Khan. "I trust your lordship will remember that you will always be welcome in the house as long as I am its owner." "That's very kind of you to say so," returned Lord Amberley warmly. "I shall look forward to some months of pleasant intercourse. And now I must be going. Tomorrow, perhaps, if you have nothing better to do, you will give us the pleasure of your company at dinner. Your fame has already gone abroad, and we shall ask 1 or 2 nice people to meet you, including my brother and sister-in-law, Lord and Lady Orpington, and my cousin, the Dutchess of Wiltshire, whose interest in China and Indian art, as perhaps you know, is only second to your own. I shall be most glad to come. We may count on seeing you in Eaton Square, then, at 8 o'clock? If I am alive, you may be sure I shall be there. Must you really go? Then good-bye, and many thanks for meeting me." His lordship having left the house, Simon Khan went upstairs to his dressing-room, which it was to be noticed he found without inquiry, and rang the electric bell beside the fireplace 3 times. While he was waiting for it to be answered, he stood looking out of the window at the long line of carriages in the street below. "Everything is progressing admirably," he said to himself. "Amberley does not suspect any more than the world in general. As a proof, he asks me to dinner tomorrow evening to meet his brother and sister-in-law, two of his particular friends, and, above all, her Grace of Wiltshire. Of course I shall go, and when I bid her Grace good-bye, it will be strange if I am not one step nearer the interest on Lizzie's money." At this moment the door opened, and his valet, the grave and respectable Belton, entered the room. Khan turned to greet him impatiently. "Come, come, Belton," he said, "we must be quick. It is 20 minutes to 12, and if we don't hurry, the folk next door will become impatient. Have you succeeded in doing what I spoke to you about last night?" "I have done everything, sir." "I'm glad to hear it. Now, lock that door and let us get to work. You can let me have your news while I am dressing." Opening one side of a massive wardrobe that completely filled one end of the room, Belton took from it a number of garments. They included a well-worn velvet coat, a baggy pair of trousers so old that only a notorious pauper or a millionaire could have afforded to wear them, a flannel waistcoat, a Gladstone collar, a soft silk tie, and a pair of embroidered carpet slippers upon which no old-clothes man in the most reckless way of business in Petticoat Lane would have advanced a single halfpenny. Into these he assisted his master to change. "Now give me the wig, and unfasten the straps of this hump," said Khan, as the other placed the garments just referred to upon a neighbouring chair. Belton did as he was ordered, and then there happened a thing the like of which no one would have believed. Having unbuckled a strap on either shoulder, and slipped his hand beneath the waistcoat, he withdrew a large papier-mâché hump, which he carried away and carefully placed in a drawer of the bureau. Relieved of his burden, Simon Khan stood up as straight and well-made a man as any in Her Majesty's dominions. The malformation, for which so many, including the Earl and Countess of Amberley, had often pitied him, was nothing but a hoax intended to produce an effect which would permit him additional facilities of disguise. The hump discarded, and the grey wig fitted carefully to his head in such a manner that not even a pinch of his own curly locks could be seen beneath it, he adorned his cheeks with a pair of crepe hair whiskers, donned the flannel vest and the velvet coat previously mentioned, slipped his feet into the carpet slippers, placed a pair of smoked glasses upon his nose, and declared himself ready to proceed about his business. The man who would have known him for Simon Khan would have been as astute as, well, shall we say, as the private detective Klimo himself. "It's on the stroke of 12, he said, as he gave a final glance at himself in the pier-glass above the dressing-table and arranged his tie to his satisfaction. "Should anyone call, instruct Ram Gafur to tell them that I have gone out on business and shall not be back until 3 o'clock. "Very good, sir. Now, undo the door and let me go in." Thus commanded, Belton went across to the large wardrobe, which, as I have already said, covered the whole of one side of the room, and opened the middle door. 2 or 3 garments were seen inside, suspended on pegs, and these he removed, at the same time pushing towards the right panel at the rear. When this was done, a large aperture in the wall between the 2 houses was disclosed. Through this door Khan passed, drawing it behind him. In number 1 Belverton Terrace, the house occupied by the detective, whose presence in the street Khan seemed to find so objectionable, the entrance thus constructed was covered by the peculiar kind of confessional box in which Klimo invariably sat to receive his clients, the rearmost panels of which opened in the same fashion as those in the wardrobe in the dressing-room. These being pulled aside, he had but to draw them to again after him, take his seat, ring the electric bell to inform his housekeeper that he was ready, and then welcome his clients as quickly as they cared to come. Punctually at 2 o'clock the interviews ceased, and Klimo, having reaped an excellent harvest of fees, returned to Porchester House to become Simon Khan once more. Possibly it was due to the fact that the Earl and Countess of Amberley were brimming over with his praise. It may have been the rumour that he was worth as many millions as you have fingers upon your hand that did it. One thing, however, was self-evident. Within 24 hours of the noble Earl's meeting him at Victoria Station, Simon Khan was the talk not only of fashionable but also of unfashionable London. that his household were, with one exception, natives of India, that he paid a rental for Porchester House which ran into 5 figures, that he was the greatest living authority upon China and Indian art generally, and that he had come over to England in search of a wife, were among the smallest of the canards set afloat concerning him. During dinner next evening, Khan put forth every effort to please. He was placed on the right hand of his hostess, and next to the Dutchess of Wiltshire. To the latter he paid particular attention, and to such good purpose that when the ladies returned to the drawing-room afterwards, her Grace was full of his praises. They had discussed china of all sorts. Khan had promised her a specimen which she had longed for all her life, but had never been able to obtain, and in return she had promised to show him the quaintly carved Indian casket, in which the famous necklace, of which he had of course heard, spent most of its time. She would be wearing the jewels in question at her own ball in a week's time, she informed him, and if he would care to see the case when it came from her bankers on that day, she would be only too pleased to show it to him. As Simon Khan drove home in his luxurious brougham afterwards, he smiled to himself as he thought of the success which was attending his first endeavour. 2 of the guests, who were stewards of the Jockey Club, had heard with delight his idea of purchasing a horse in order to have an interest in the Derby, while another, on hearing that he desired to become the possessor of a yacht, had offered to propose him for the RCYC. To crown it all, however, and much better than all, the Dutchess of Wiltshire had promised to show him her famous diamonds. By this time next week, he said to himself, Liz's interest should be considerably closer. But, satisfactory as my progress has been hitherto, it is difficult to see how I am to get possession of the stones. From what I have been able to discover, they are only brought from the bank on the day the Duchess intends to wear them, and they are taken back by his Grace the following morning. While she's got them on her person, it would be manifestly impossible to get them from her, and as, when she takes them off, they are returned to their box and placed in a safe constructed in the wall of the bedroom adjoining, and which for the occasion is occupied by the butler and one of the under-footmen, the only key being in possession of the Duke himself, it would be equally foolish to hope to appropriate them. In what manner, therefore, I am to become their possessor passes my comprehension. However, one thing is certain. Obtained they must be, and the attempt must be made on the night of the ball, if possible. In the meantime, I'll set my wits to work upon a plan. Next day, Simon Khan was the recipient of an invitation to the ball in question, and 2 days later he called upon the Duchess of Wiltshire at her residence in Belgrave Square with a plan prepared. He also took with him the small vase he had promised her 4 nights before. She received him most graciously, and their talk fell at once into the usual channel. Having examined her collection and charmed her by means of 1 or 2 judicious criticisms, he asked permission to include photographs of certain of her treasures in his forthcoming book. Then, little by little, he skilfully guided the conversation onto the subject of jewels. "Since we are discussing gems, Mr. Khan," she said, "perhaps it would interest you to see my famous necklace. By good fortune I have it in the house now, for the reason that an alteration is being made to one of the clasps by my jewellers." "I should like to see it immensely," answered Khan. "At one time and another I have had the good fortune to examine the jewels of the leading Indian princes, and I should like to be able to say that I had seen the famous Wiltshire necklace." "Then you shall certainly have that honour," she answered with a smile. "If you will ring that bell, I will send for it." Khan rang the bell as requested, and when the butler entered he was given the key of the safe and ordered to bring the case to the drawing-room. "We must not keep it very long," she observed while the man was absent. "It is to be returned to the bank in an hour's time." "I am indeed fortunate," Khan replied, and turned to the description of some curious Indian wood carving on which he was making a special feature in his book. As he explained, he had collected his illustrations from the doors of Indian temples, from the gateways of palaces, from old brass work, and even from carved chairs and boxes he had picked up in all sorts of odd corners. Her Grace was most interested. "How strange that you should have mentioned it," she said. "If carved boxes have any interest for you, it is possible my jewel case itself may be of use to you. As I think I told you during Lady Amberley's dinner, it came from Benares, and has carved upon it the portraits of nearly every god in the Hindu pantheon." "You raised my curiosity to fever heat," said Khan. A few moments later the servant returned, bringing with him a wooden box about 16 inches long by 12 wide, and 8 deep, which he placed upon a table beside his mistress, after which he retired. "This is the case to which I have just been referring," said the Duchess, placing her hand on the article in question. "If you glance at it, you will see how exquisitely it is carved." Concealing his eagerness with an effort, Simon Khan drew his chair up to the table and examined the box. It was with justice she had described it as a work of art. What the wood was of which it was constructed, Khan was unable to tell. It was dark and heavy, and though it was not teak, closely resembled it. It was literally covered with quaint carving, and of its kind was a unique work of art. "It is most curious and beautiful," said Khan, when he had finished his examination. "In all my experience, I can safely say I have never seen its equal. If you will permit me, I should very much like to include a description and an illustration of it in my book." "Of course you may do so. I shall be only too delighted," answered her Grace. "If it will help you in your work, I shall be glad to lend it to you for a few hours in order that you may have the illustration made." This was exactly what Khan had been waiting for, and he accepted the offer with alacrity. "Very well, then," she said. "On the day of my ball, when it will be brought from the bank again, I will take the necklace out and send the case to you. I must make one proviso, however, and that is that you let me have it back the same day." "I will certainly promise to do that," replied Khan. "And now let us look inside," said his hostess. Choosing a key from a bunch she carried in her pocket, she unlocked the casket and lifted the lid. Accustomed as Khan had all his life been to the sight of gems, what he saw before him then almost took his breath away. The inside of the box, both sides and bottom, was quilted with the softest Russia leather, and on this luxurious couch reposed the famous necklace. The fire of the stones, when the light caught them, was sufficient to dazzle the eyes, so fierce was it. As Khan could see, every gem was perfect of its kind, and there were no fewer than 300 of them. The setting was a fine example of the jeweller's art. And last but not least, the value of the whole affair was £50,000, a mere flea bite to the man who had given it to his wife, but a fortune to any humbler person. "And now that you have seen my property, what do you think of it?" asked the Duchess, as she watched her visitor's face. "It is very beautiful," he answered, "and I do not wonder that you are proud of it. Yes, the diamonds are very fine, but I think it is their abiding place that fascinates me more. Have you any objection to my measuring it?" "Pray do so, if it is likely to be of any assistance to you," replied her Grace. Khan thereupon produced a small ivory rule, ran it over the box, and the figures he thus obtained he jotted down in his pocket-book. 10 minutes later, when the case had been returned to the safe, he thanked the Duchess for her kindness and took his departure, promising to call in person for the empty case on the morning of the ball. Reaching home, he passed into his study, and seating himself at his writing table, pulled a sheet of notepaper towards him and began to sketch, as well as he could remember it, the box he had seen. Then he leant back in his chair and closed his eyes. "I've cracked a good many hard nuts in my time," he said reflectively, "but never one that seemed so difficult at first sight as this. As far as I see at present, the case stands as follows. The box will be brought from the bank, where it usually reposes, to Wiltshire House on the morning of the dance. I shall be allowed to have possession of it, without the stones, of course, for a period possibly extending from 11 o'clock in the morning to 4 or 5, at any rate not later than 7 in the evening. After the ball, the necklace will be returned to it, when it will be locked up in the safe, over which the butler and a footman will mount guard. To get into the room during the night is not only too risky, but physically out of the question, while to rob her Grace of her treasure during the progress of the dance would be equally impossible. The Duke fetches the casket and takes it back to the bank himself. So, to all intents and purposes, I'm almost as far off the solution as ever. Half an hour went by and found him still seated at his desk, staring at the drawing on the paper. Then an hour. The traffic of the streets rolled past the house unheeded. Finally, Joa Singh announced his carriage, and feeling that an idea might come to him with a change of scene, he set off for a drive in the park. By this time his elegant mail phaeton, with its magnificent horses and Indian servant on the seat behind, was as well known as Her Majesty's state equipage, and attracted almost as much attention. Today, however, the fashionable world noticed that Simon Khan looked preoccupied. He was still working out his problem, but so far without much success. Suddenly something, no one will ever be able to say what, put an idea into his head. The notion was no sooner born in his brain than he left the park and drove home quickly. 10 minutes had scarcely elapsed before he was back in his study again, and had ordered that Wajib Baksh should be sent to him. When the man he wanted put in an appearance, Khan handed him the paper upon which he had made the drawing of the jewel case. "Look at this," he said, "and tell me what thou seest there." "I see a box," answered the man, who by this time was well accustomed to his master's ways. "As thou sayest, it is a box," said Khan. "The wood is heavy and thick, though what wood it is I do not know. The measurements are upon the paper below. Within, both the sides and bottom are quilted with soft leather, as I have also shown. Think now, Wajib Baksh, for in this case thou wilt need to have all thy wits about thee. Tell me, is it in thy power, O most cunning of all craftsmen, to insert such extra sides within this box that they, being held by a spring, shall lie so snug as not to be noticeable to the ordinary eye? Can it be so arranged that when the box is locked, they shall fall flat upon the bottom, thus covering and holding fast what lies beneath them, and yet making the box appear to the eye as if it were empty? Is it possible for thee to do such a thing?" Wajib Baksh did not reply for a few moments. His instinct told him what his master wanted, and he was not disposed to answer hastily, for he also saw that his reputation as the most cunning craftsman in India was at stake. "If the heaven-born will permit me the night for thought," he said at last, "I will come to him when he rises from his bed and tell him what I can do, and he can then give his orders as it pleases him." "Very good," said Khan. "Then tomorrow morning I shall expect thy report. Let the work be good, and there will be many rupees for thee to touch in return. As to the lock and the way it shall act, let that be the concern of Hiram Singh." Wajib Baksh salaamed and withdrew, and Simon Khan for the time being dismissed the matter from his mind. Next morning, while he was dressing, Belton reported that the two artificers desired an interview with him. He ordered them to be admitted, and forthwith they entered the room. It was noticeable that Wajib Baksh carried in his hand a heavy box, which, upon Khan's motioning him to do so, he placed upon the table. "Have ye thought over the matter?" he asked, seeing that the men waited for him to speak. "We have thought of it," replied Hiram Singh, who always acted as spokesman for the pair. "If the presence will deign to look, he will see that we have made a box of the size and shape such as he drew upon the paper." "Yes, it is certainly a good copy," said Khan condescendingly, after he had examined it. Wajib Baksh showed his white teeth in appreciation of the compliment, and Hiram Singh drew closer to the table. "And now, if the Sahib will open it, he will in his wisdom be able to tell if it resembles the other that he has in his mind." Khan opened the box as requested, and discovered that the interior was an exact counterfeit of the Dutchess of Wiltshire's jewel case, even to the extent of the quilted leather lining which had been the other's principal feature. He admitted that the likeness was all that could be desired. "As he is satisfied," said Hiram Singh, "it may be that the protector of the poor will deign to try an experiment with it. See, here is a comb. Let it be placed in the box. So. Now he will see what he will see." The broad, silver-backed comb lying upon his dressing-table was placed on the bottom of the box. The lid was closed and the key turned in the box. The case being securely fastened, Hiram Singh laid it before his master. "I am to open it, I suppose?" said Khan, taking the key and replacing it in the lock. "If my master pleases," replied the other. Khan accordingly turned it in the lock, and having done so, raised the lid and looked inside. His astonishment was complete. To all intents and purposes the box was empty. The comb was not to be seen, and yet the quilted sides and bottom were, to all appearances, just the same as when he had first looked inside. "This is most wonderful," he said. And indeed it was as clever a conjuring trick as any he had ever seen. "Nay, it is very simple," Wajib Baksh replied. "The heaven-born told me that there must be no risk of detection." He took the box in his own hands, and running his nails down the centre of the quilting, dividing the false bottom into two pieces, these he lifted out, revealing the comb lying on the real bottom beneath. "The sides, as my lord will see," said Hiram Singh, taking a step forward, "are held in their appointed places by these two springs. Thus, when the key is turned, the springs relax, and the sides are driven by others into their places on the bottom, where the seams in the quilting mask the join. But there is one disadvantage. It is as follows. When the pieces which form the bottom are lifted out, in order that my lord may get at whatever lies concealed beneath, the springs must of necessity stand revealed. However, to anyone who knows sufficient of the working of the box to lift out the false bottom, it will be an easy matter to withdraw the springs and conceal them about his person." "As you say, that is an easy matter," said Khan, "and I shall not be likely to forget. Now, one other question. Presuming I'm in a position to put the real box into your hands for, say, 8 hours, do you think that in that time you can fit it up so that detection will be impossible?" "Assuredly, my lord," replied Hiram Singh with conviction. "There is but the lock and the fitting of the springs to be done. 3 hours at most would suffice for that." "I am pleased with you," said Khan. "As a proof of my satisfaction, when the work is finished, you will each receive 500 rupees. Now you can go." According to his promise, 10 o'clock on the Friday following found him in his hansom driving towards Belgrave Square. He was a little anxious, though the casual observer would scarcely have been able to tell it. The magnitude of the stake for which he was playing was enough to try the nerve of even such a past master in his profession as Simon Khan. Arriving at the house, he discovered some workmen erecting an awning across the footway in preparation for the ball that was to take place at night. It was not long, however, before he found himself in the boudoir, reminding Her Grace of her promise to permit him an opportunity of making a drawing of the famous jewel case. The Duchess was naturally busy, and within a quarter of an hour he was on his way home with the box placed on the seat of the carriage beside him. "Now," he said as he patted it good-humouredly, "if only the notion worked out by Hiram Singh and Wajib Baksh holds good, the famous Wiltshire diamonds will become my property before very many hours are past. By this time tomorrow, I suppose London will be all agog concerning the burglary." On reaching his house, he left his carriage and himself carried the box into his study. Once there, he rang his bell and ordered Hiram Singh and Wajib Baksh to be sent to him. When they arrived, he showed them the box upon which they were to exercise their ingenuity. "Bring your tools in here," he said, "and do the work under my own eyes. You have but 9 hours before you, so you must make the most of them." The men went for their implements, and as soon as they were ready set to work. All through the day they were kept hard at it, with the result that by 5 o'clock the alterations had been effected and the case stood ready. By the time Khan returned from his afternoon drive in the park, it was quite prepared for the part it was to play in his scheme. Having praised the men, he turned them out and locked the door, then went across the room and unlocked a drawer in his writing table. From it he took a flat leather jewel case, which he opened. It contained a necklace of counterfeit diamonds, if anything a little larger than the one he intended to try to obtain. He had purchased it that morning in the Burlington Arcade for the purpose of testing the apparatus his servants had made, and this he now proceeded to do. Laying it carefully upon the bottom, he closed the lid and turned the key. When he opened it again, the necklace was gone, and even though he knew the secret, he could not for the life of him see where the false bottom began and ended. After that he reset the trap and tossed the necklace carelessly in. To his delight, it acted as well as on the previous occasion. He could scarcely contain his satisfaction. His conscience was sufficiently elastic to give him no trouble. To him it was scarcely a robbery he was planning, but an artistic trial of skill, in which he pitted his wits and cunning against the forces of society in general. That is the end of The Dutchess of Wiltshire's Diamonds by Guy Boothby, Part 1. Recording by Nigel Carrington in London, England, April 2011.